Young Turks now has audio, the TYT Audio Network, podcasts of some of your favorite shows and new shows, including one with Nina Turner, former Ohio State Senator. She's going to do We the People with Nina Turner, talking about equality and justice and seeing that through the eyes of regular Americans who are affected by politics and policy. Everybody check it out at tyt.com/audio.
Donald Trump's summit with Kim Jong Un, the leader and dictator of North Korea, has happened, and they have signed some sort of agreement, although that agreement is vague, and we'll get to the terms of that agreement in just a moment. But following the meeting, Trump did speak to the press and said the following. He said that he was suspending joint military exercises with South Korean forces, and that he was confident Mr. Kim would begin dismantling his nuclear arsenal very quickly. Now, that news caught South Korea by surprise. They had no idea that was coming. And based on that very statement, it appears that the United States has already made a large concession, a big concession to South Korea. There's also talk of the US.
North Korea.
I'm sorry, to North Korea, my apologies. A big concession to North Korea. And another concession is the idea of bringing US troops who are currently stationed in South Korea home to the United States. Currently, there are about 28,000 American troops in South Korea, and that concession could destabilize the region. South Korea is very much concerned about that, but the only agreement that Kim Jong Un made was complete nuclearization, which sounds good, but there is no talk of a timetable, and there is no talk of a verification process to ensure that Kim Jong Un upholds his side of the deal. Now, we'll get into specifics and more details in just a second, but I wanted to get some quick reactions from you guys before we move forward.
The only thing new from this is that America has made a huge concession.
Yeah.
That's not what we expected going in. I don't think what anyone expected going in. And I'm not surprised at all that in the end of it, it's we will continue to have talks to see what North Korea will do.
That's right, that's right.
So I'm confident they will begin soon. Possibly, maybe not. We're going to talk about, like, what?
Yeah.
Well, we talked about this yesterday as something that was going to be primarily a photo op, and it was really a bunch of pageantry and largely ceremonial. So from that standpoint, I'm not surprised there are no details. There are really no details that could be possible in a meeting of such brevity, and it was really designed just for this moment, to see these two leaders shake hands. Now, let's leave aside whether or not this is a good thing, but just talk about what Anna is mentioning, which is that there is out of left field this concession that we're going to stop these what are perceived as sort of aggressive military maneuvers that threaten in some way North Korea's safety. At least this is the way it's being cast. That's not an unfair way to cast it. I would say this. Overall, and believe me, we can talk about Kim, and we talked about him yesterday, and I talked about what a horrible, horrible dictator he is. It's a gulag nation, and most of his nation is starving, and we can get back into that. But just on the point that you're talking about, Anna, I'm not sure, and I think people who have to speak honestly about this have to agree, I'm not sure that some small concession, even some large concession on our part, doesn't help de-escalate the tensions there. And that's a net gain for the world. We've come in this weird way, and it's a bizarre, perverted way that we've come to this place. But having said that, if we can get some peace on the Korean Peninsula, that'd be good. Now, finally, the troops. That's a different thing.
That is absolutely a different thing.
Because that does ensure security to some. China would love to see us get those troops off of the Korean Peninsula.
You're absolutely right about that, and the reaction from China has been a favorable one. They're happy with these talks. They're happy with the outcome of these talks. And again, right now, we really have no idea how things will proceed, because what they signed, what Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump signed, was very skimpy on details.
It's nothing new.
There was really nothing there. But again, there were large concessions by Donald Trump that go against the interests of our ally, South Korea, right? So let's get into more of those details. So Trump's decision to suspend the war games, which he described as, quote, very expensive, but also, quote, very provocative, given the continuing negotiations appear to take South Korea by surprise. So the military exercises are one thing, but what also got South Korea a little worried was the idea of pulling US military out of South Korea, because that essentially messages to North Korea, any form of provocation could be met with military action, with the United States backing the South Koreans. Taking the troops out of the country and bringing them back home could really destabilize that situation. And also, if you look at the terms of this agreement that they signed, who acts first? Is Trump gonna bring the troops back home and then we wait for them to denuclearize and then we lift the sanctions? How does that happen? How does it get verified? Now, South Korea did respond to this. The US and the DPRK, I'm sorry, this is actually more of the agreement. The US and the DPRK will join their efforts to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. Okay, how?
Exactly, that's just more generic.
Exactly, so let's hear from the South Korean spokesperson on this. USFK has received no updated guidance on execution or secession of training exercises to include this fall's schedule, Ulchi Freedom Guardian. So in cooperation with our South Korean partners, we will continue with our current military posture until we receive updated guidance from the Department of Defense and/or Indo-Pacific Command. All right, so guess what? The Department of Defense also wasn't notified about this unilateral decision that Donald Trump made. So let's go to their statement. The Department of Defense continues to work with the White House, the interagency, and our allies and partners on a way forward following the summit. We will provide additional information as it becomes available. But again, they were unaware that Trump would offer to bring troops home or end these military exercises. All right, so with that said, let's take a look at what Donald Trump had to say to the press about these so-called war games.
So one of the things that I suggested and I want to do is we're going to stop the war games. Flying to South Korea to practice and then drop bombs all over the place and then go back to Guam. We are going to get out of the war games that cost so much money. So under the circumstances that we're negotiating a very comprehensive, complete deal, I think it's inappropriate to be having war games. And I'm doing something that I've wanted to do from the beginning. We stopped playing those war games that cost us a fortune. The war games are very expensive. We pay for a big majority of them. We fly in bombers from Guam. I know a lot about airplanes. It's very expensive. Because I think, number one, it's very provocative, and I want to do it, and I think they're very happy about it because it is so provocative. And I think it's very provocative. It's a very provocative situation. I wanted to stop the war games. I thought they were very provocative, but I also think they're very expensive. It really is something that I think they very much appreciated. And I think it's very provocative, especially, George, since we're getting along.
So I just want to clarify something in regard to Trump saying that these war games are expensive. It just seems a little silly and strange for someone like Trump to make that argument when he himself has advocated and pushed for a military parade in Washington, D.C. that would cost somewhere between $10 to $30 million. So if you're really genuinely concerned about how expensive it is, maybe don't consider wasting taxpayer money on a military parade just so you feel better about yourself and puff up your chest. But he is saying the word provocative over and over again, which plays into the narrative that Kim Jong Un wants to push out there. And by the way, mind you, the concessions are one thing. Another portion of this is how much this meeting has legitimized Kim Jong Un's place in the world, in the international stage, because he's out there in Singapore taking selfies with world leaders, gallivanting around town. This has really led to a certain level of credibility that North Koreans have been craving. And I do agree that it's better that Trump takes this route of diplomacy, but he has gone a little too far, and that's what I'm concerned about.
We're now celebrating him.
Yeah.
I'm always thinking the basis for the reasoning. That's the thing. So when Trump speaks out of both sides of his mouth all the time, 1 minute he's for immigration, next minute he's not, depending on which immigrants we're talking about. It's with anything. So again with this, so when people say, how could you guys be against what he's saying? You're just out there just to be opposing because it's him. Well, if he says both things, we have to now try to determine how he came up to each of those scenarios. And the reason he came to this scenario is at the end of that whole compilation was because they're being so nice to me now. Now we're getting along. Now they're my friends. It's not based on anything of reality, anything your experts told you, anything of what the repercussions of previously doing the military exercises were doing, which a lot of people believe nothing, except for puff out your chest, which you were a fan of before. So now it's just, people can easily say, hey, I like you. Hey, nice hair, guy. Hey, we can get along today, won't we? And you'll give him anything we want. So it's not these concessions, these particular ones, it's the next ones you'll give because he gave you a piece of cake.
But there is a caveat that I wanted to quickly mention because remember, Macron from France was very complimentary to Trump because he understood this is the strategy to use if you want to get through to Trump and if you want him to agree with you on the issues, including the Iran nuclear deal, for instance, which France did not want Trump to pull out of. But Trump quickly turned on Macron and went against what Macron wanted. And I realized something. Trump is much more willing to go against our allies and favor our adversaries. So that's certainly the case with North Korea, with Russia. And I think that he, for some reason, has some sort of affection for those who tend to be dictators, those who have a dictatorial streak. And he will say the worst things about Justin Trudeau and call him weak and meek, but then turn around and say all of these great complimentary things about someone like Kim Jong Un. Look, the outcome of this meeting further alienated our allies. Now we're alienating South Korea and Japan. I mean, these are things that we should all consider, even though, again, there is that silver lining of diplomacy rather than insults on Twitter.
Right, because it's not just friends. We have a very clear set of friends that he is slowly turning into enemies. And we've seen this happen specifically this week multiple times already. It's, I guess, new friends that everyone else is telling him not to interact with.
Well, he does have a thing for strongmen, you know. It's true. I mean, Duterte and Erdogan and Putin and Kim now and so on. I could go on. It's true. And he himself has got sort of strongman tendencies, right? He'd like to sort of be, and he praises Kim for being a tough guy and taking a position of power at a young age and ruling with a tough hand. I mean, these are all pretty disgusting things when you look at the details. But to what JR is saying, it's interesting, you know, if you end up in a good place, a place of peace, and I know I'm gonna get barked out of the room on this, but I'd rather end up in a place of peace for the wrong reasons. That is to say, just because they gave him cake and gave him a parade, if it ends me up in a good place, and if it's a net positive in terms of producing peace, I'm for it. The problem is the details that follow beyond this ceremony, I don't know that we're gonna see any follow through at all. Trump got his moment. He got his photo up and he gets to proclaim, I brought peace to the Korean Peninsula. But as you're gonna detail, when you compare this to the agreement that he was not such a fan of, like the Iran agreement, it leaves us not in the best position.
The Iran agreement specifically had a process of verification that indicated that they would stop their nuclear programs. We don't have that with North Korea. Now, the argument that you'll hear from some of the supporters of this agreement, of the North Korea agreement, is that, well, there will be follow-up meetings to kind of hash out those details. And by the way, Republicans in Congress, to their credit, are fighting to have this, done through Congress in the form of a treaty. So you can really, I guess, solidify the terms of how this is all going to be done. And the reason why I say to their credit is because one of the biggest criticisms that Republicans in Congress had toward Obama and the Iran nuclear deal is that Obama acted unilaterally. And they're making the same arguments in regard to Trump. And so you don't see that often in politics. Usually things become tribal and you'll see people support their side while simultaneously and hypocritically criticizing the other side. But in this case, Republicans in Congress are saying, no. We need to do this through a treaty. We need to do this through Congress. Now, another part of their agreement was that the joint statement said that two nations would hold a follow-up negotiations led by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and a high-level North Korean official at the earliest possible date to implement the outcomes of the summit meeting. We'll see if that happens. But as things stand right now, I think people are right in being skeptical.
Pompeo, though, I want to remind everybody, Pompeo lit up Obama over normalizing relations in any way with Cuba. He was brutal about it. So it's so weird to see these guys back Trump and somehow support him in a meeting with a dictator who makes the situation in Cuba look like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
That's right. I mean, the situation in Cuba, the Castros weren't developing nuclear weapons to cause severe harm. They weren't threatening us. They weren't threatening our allies. You know, you might have issues with the way Cuba is run. You might have issues with communism. I hear you on that. But at the same time, they did not pose an imminent threat to the United States. They didn't. I mean, they did decades ago, but they certainly don't today. And the idea that Pompeo would be, critical of Obama and his stance on Cuba, and then all of a sudden brokering a peace deal.
It's like these guys all have collective amnesia. It's crazy.
And the issues that one should have with Cuba, they're not on the table when discussing North Korea.
That's right.
And by the way, let me just say, I'd rather they just say, well, times have changed, and I did have at least acknowledge that you are backpedaling on an original position. Yeah. You could even say I may have overstated it and maybe politics got the better of me. At least I would be honest to what's going on here. These are very important issues, and I hate to use the word that Anna just used a moment ago, to see tribalism dictate what our decision-making process is.
Exactly. Now, just one more video that kind of shows you how much Trump has played into the narrative that the North Koreans want, okay? So there was a lot of concern about whether or not Trump would address human rights violations. He did not address those violations during this meeting with Kim Jong Un. However, he did talk about this issue with the press following the summit. Take a look.
And you, at that point, said that North Korea has more brutally oppressed its people than any other regime on earth. Do you still believe that is the case, having sat down with Kim Jong Un? And does he need to change that?
John, I believe it's a rough situation over there. There's no question about it. And we did discuss it today. We'll be doing something on it. It's rough. It's rough in a lot of places, by the way.
They didn't really discuss it. And when he says it's rough in a lot of places, I find it fascinating because, again, it plays into what Kim Jong Un wants. Yes, there are human rights violations in other countries. There are human rights violations in countries that we do business with, including Saudi Arabia. However, you are making excuses for Kim Jong Un, or at least minimizing how brutal he is to his own people by making that statement.
It was the last part of that statement I had a problem with. I understand the president's in a tough position right there. You're being held to the fire on one issue that you've made an issue, that you've acknowledged, the human rights issue and what's going on inside the country. So you have to waffle it. It's one of those situations where, as a politician, you have to kind of play it generically, which he did. He said it's a rough situation over there. That was his way of saying, I still believe it's pretty brutal. But then the last thing he said was, but, it's brutal in a lot of places all over the world. Yes, that completely normalizes it or takes it to a place where it suggests anyway that it's more commonplace than just in North Korea, whereas we know North Korea arguably the head of the table when it comes to this kind of brutality.
Absolutely.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.